Okay, so today we're diving into a topic that I know can be, well, kind of tricky for a lot of parents, and that's how to talk to your kids about sex and safety and all that, especially when your child is on the autism spectrum. It's definitely something that brings up a lot of questions, maybe even some anxieties, you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. It's such a huge part of raising kids and,
Ooh.
figuring out how to guide them. And it's true, like you said, with any child, these conversations can be tough. But when we're talking about kids on the spectrum, it kind of adds this whole other layer, right?
Yeah.
Because they experience and understand the world in a different way. So we really got to be mindful of that. And for this deep dive, we looked at like a bunch of expert advice and real life stories to try and understand the specific stuff that families who have kids on the spectrum are dealing with, the challenges they face.
Right. And I think that's what we really want to do today is kind of give our listeners some solid advice and things to consider. Like we want to equip you guys to tackle these conversations head on and support your kids in the best way possible. So I guess a good place to start is with like the whole vulnerability and safety thing, right?
Exactly. And one of the first things we got to acknowledge is that, unfortunately, individuals with developmental disabilities, and that includes ASD, they're at a much higher risk of experiencing sexual abuse compared to the general population, like twice the rate.
Wow, that's pretty heavy.
It is. It's
Yeah.
really important to be aware of that.
Yeah, and it's not just about like having difficulty understanding emotions, right? I mean, there must be other reasons why kids on the spectrum might be more vulnerable.
Oh, for sure. Like research has shown that for a lot of people on the spectrum, it can be harder for them to really understand like what other people's intentions are, or even just their emotions. And because they might take things super literally, they can be easier to manipulate or, trick into doing something they shouldn't. And then, tragically, nonverbal kids are sometimes targeted because people think wrongly that they can't report abuse.
It's awful to think about. And what's really striking is that it's not just the kids who are nonverbal who might struggle to talk about it if something has happened.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Even kids on the spectrum who can talk, they can still have a really hard time disclosing abuse, coming forward and telling someone. Like we read about this 11-year-old Felix who went through something really scary at the park, but he didn't say anything to anyone. He was just too scared and he didn't know how to explain what had happened.
That's so sad. And it makes you realize that the signs that something's wrong might not always be super obvious.
Exactly. You got to be really tuned in to any changes in their behavior. Like with Felix, after that happened, he started acting out more, getting aggressive, and he started using these new words, inappropriate words, and asking questions about, showing his private parts. And it's a reminder that when kids' behavior changes, even if it seems like it's getting worse, it could be a sign that they're really upset about something, and we need to create that space where they feel safe to talk to us. Like Felix's parents found out that the most important thing was to just reassure him that he wasn't in trouble. That helped
Yeah.
him open up.
That's so important. And even when a child on the spectrum does try to communicate, sometimes there can be these misunderstandings because they tend to interpret language so literally,
Yeah.
right?
hmm
Like with Felix and the whole thing about the teenager versus an adult, that was a really clear example of that.
Totally. That kind of literal interpretation of questions, it happens all the time. Like when they kept asking Felix if an adult had hurt him, he kept saying no because the person who did it was a teenager. So you can see how crucial it is to be super precise and clear with our language, especially when we're talking about these sensitive topics.
So, like, what can parents actually do knowing all of this?
Well, being proactive is key, right? Start early before you think you need to. Like using social stories to explain what unwanted touches and make it super clear that it's never okay, that's a great first step. Social stories are awesome because they're visual and they follow this predictable format, so they're easier for kids on the spectrum to understand. And then for kids who are higher functioning, it's super important to teach them about consent, how to recognize when someone's not okay with something and to respect that.
Okay, so we've talked about vulnerability and safety, which are obviously huge. But now let's get into the whole dating and sex thing, which I know is a major worry for a lot of parents of kids on the spectrum.
Yeah, it's a big one. I mean, dating and sex are complicated for any teenager, right? But for kids on the spectrum, it can be even more so because they often struggle with those subtle social cues that are so important in romantic relationships. And honestly, with online dating and social media, it's just getting more and more complex for all young people these days.
So where do we even begin with these conversations about dating and sex? It can feel so daunting.
Well, I think the main thing is to start early and be straightforward, even if your child seems, less mature than their age might suggest. We came across this story, and it was really surprising, about this 17-year-old who had really significant communication delays. Like, he wasn't even verbal until he was 6. And then, out of the blue, he kissed a girl who also had autism. And it just shows that interest in physical relationships can develop even when a child might seem behind in other areas. It's a good reminder that we can't wait until they seem ready in the traditional sense to start talking about these things.
That's a good point. It's like we can't just assume they're not interested or that they'll figure it out on their own.
Exactly. And just like with teaching about safety, tools like social stories and video modeling, even role playing, they can be really helpful for teaching the practical aspects of dating. Like, how do you ask someone out? What should you expect on a date? What are the different stages of intimacy? Stuff like that.
Right. And speaking of intimacy, consent is obviously a crucial part of all of this.
It's absolutely essential. We have to be really explicit about teaching kids on the spectrum how to ask for consent and how to give consent verbally at every stage of a relationship. It needs to be super clear, no room for misinterpretation.
What about all those unspoken rules of dating that, like, neurotypical kids seem to pick up on? That must be a huge challenge for someone with ASD who struggles with social cues.
Oh, for sure. Like, understanding who might be open to a date invitation, or, the idea that you should get to know someone before you start getting physical. These are things that a lot of neurotypical teens just kind of absorb from their environment. But for kids on the spectrum, we have to lay it all out, make it explicit.
And then, of course, there's the whole internet and social media thing, which just adds another layer of complexity.
It does. Just like with any teenager, you got to set clear rules about what's okay to post online and how to interact with people on social media. And while kids on the spectrum are often really good at following rules, they might miss those more nuanced social rules that govern online behavior, like understanding why it's not okay to forward a message that's mean or harassing, even if they think it's funny.
Yeah, and that story about Julian, the 16-year-old with high-functioning autism, who forwarded a nude photo because he thought it was a joke, that really highlights how even seemingly harmless actions can have big consequences when you don't fully understand the social context.
It does. It just goes to show how important it is to talk about these things openly and directly, even if it feels uncomfortable.
Totally. And, beyond just understanding external threats in relationships, I think developing those practical self-care skills is also a big part of feeling safe and independent. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. This is an area where so many parents of kids on the spectrum face constant challenges. And, it's understandable when you have sensory sensitivities, which are super common with ASD, and you struggle with social understanding. Things like personal hygiene can become a real battle. Tasks that seem automatic for other teens, like cutting your hair or nails, taking a shower, shaving, they can be totally overwhelming sensory experiences. And sometimes there's just a lack of motivation because they don't really get why it's so important.
And it's not even just about the sensory stuff, right? It seems like there's also a difference in how that, like, inherent drive to groom yourself and present yourself in a certain way develops.
You're right. A lot of typically developing teens, they start to become more aware of how they look and like what's socially acceptable. As they get older, it becomes more important to them. But that doesn't always happen in the same way for individuals on the spectrum. So we have to step in and provide that explicit instruction, those visual supports, and those consistent routines that they really thrive on.
So, like, what are some practical things parents can do to make those self-care tasks easier?
Well, breaking everything down into smaller, manageable steps is huge. Like, instead of just saying, go take a shower, you give them a visual checklist with pictures showing each step. Get undressed, turn on the water, get in, wash your hair, wash your body, and so on. And keep it posted in the bathroom where they can see it.
That visual structure makes a lot of sense.
Right. It helps create predictability, which is really calming for a lot of people on the spectrum. And it's super helpful if other adults in their lives, like their therapists, teachers, anyone who works with them, are reinforcing those routines too. And when you're buying hygiene products, think about their sensory sensitivities. Like, unscented stuff might be better, or maybe an electric razor instead of a traditional one, things like that.
The sources we looked at also talked a lot about social stories and video modeling as being super helpful for teaching self-care.
Yeah, they can be really effective. With social stories, you can explain the why, the importance of hygiene in a way that makes sense to them. And then video modeling, like, film someone going through their morning routine. That can make the whole process really concrete and easy to follow. There's actually this great resource called Hygiene and Related Behaviors for Children and Adolescents with Autism Spectrum and Related Disorders. It was written by Kelly J. Muller, and it has all these fun activities and worksheets that can make learning these skills more engaging.
Okay. And one specific area of self-care that can be, especially sensitive and difficult for girls on the spectrum is menstruation.
Definitely. Menstruation can be a whole other challenge, and it's for a few reasons. Like those hormonal changes can sometimes lead to more aggression, more intense obsessions, and even things like seizures or worse, depression in some cases. And then you add in the sensory sensitivities. A lot of girls on the spectrum really struggle with pads and tampons and the general challenges with self-care routines, and it can be a lot to handle.
It sounds like preparing girls for menstruation, like well in advance, is really important.
Oh, it's crucial. It's about preparing them practically and emotionally, making sure they understand what to expect. Like they might need a lot of support with things like tracking their periods, knowing when to expect them, learning to pack supplies, and just understanding how to change a pad. For many girls with sensory issues, pads are going to be easier than tampons. And again, break it down into small steps. Use repetition, use social stories to explain what's happening, maybe set up some reminders, whatever works for them.
Another thing we see come up a lot with folks on the spectrum is sleep problems.
Yeah, sleep disturbances are super common, and they can be made worse by a bunch of things like health problems, like GI issues, mental health stuff like depression and anxiety, even just changes in their routine. And when they don't get enough sleep, it can really make their core autism symptoms worse, more pronounced. And some medications like SSRIs can affect sleep too, so that's something to keep in mind.
So what are some things parents can do to help with sleep?
Well, having a consistent bedtime routine is really important. Like, do the same relaxing activities every night before bed, like reading or listening to calming music. Make sure their bedroom is comfortable, comfy clothes, comfy bedding. Weighted blankets can be amazing for some kids. And definitely turn off all screens, like at least an hour before bedtime. Teenagers are naturally going to want to stay up later, but they still need around 9 hours of sleep. And if they're really struggling, talk to their doctor about melatonin. It can be helpful in some cases.
Exercise seems to be another big one that maybe doesn't get enough attention.
You're so right. Studies have shown, like over and over again, that regular exercise can make a big difference. It can reduce those repetitive behaviors, those meltdowns, those outbursts. It lowers stress, hyperactivity, aggression. It can even improve their mood and their memory. And it helps regulate sleep, which we just talked about.
And what's interesting is that team sports, with all the social interaction stuff, they're not always the best fit. But there are tons of other ways for kids on the spectrum to get active.
Absolutely. Like things that provide a lot of sensory input, like trampolining, swimming, those can be great. Or individual sports like running or track. And if they have motor skill differences, a coach might need to break down activities into smaller steps and modify things a little bit. Resistance bands and exercise balls can also be super helpful for developing specific skills. And some areas even have personal trainers who specialize in working with kids on the spectrum. I think the main thing is finding something they enjoy and that meets their needs. It can make a world of difference, especially for teenagers, in terms of managing their emotions and preventing those blow-ups.
Now, this next topic might be a little surprising to some listeners because, the thinking has kind of changed in recent years. And that's drug and alcohol use in people with autism.
Yeah, there was this idea for a long time that, because people with autism might be more socially isolated, they're less likely to get involved with drugs and alcohol. But actually, newer research is showing that's not really true. Like, there was this big study in Sweden that found that adults with autism are actually twice as likely to develop substance abuse problems compared to neurotypical adults. And the risk was even higher for those who also have ADHD. While severe addiction might be less common in people with more severe autism, it's definitely something we need to be talking about.
So what are some of the reasons why we might be seeing this increased risk in these newer studies?
Well, there are a few theories. Like, for some folks, it might be a way to cope with anxiety, especially social anxiety. Or maybe it's related to OCD tendencies or impulsivity. Others might be looking for pleasure or sensory relief. But the point is, even if your teenager doesn't have a typical social life, they could still be at risk. There was another study from Washington University that found that people with autistic traits were more likely to develop alcohol problems if they started drinking, and those with both autistic and ADHD traits were more likely to use marijuana. There's even some thought that people with autism might be more prone to drinking alone, which could increase the risk of problems.
And it sounds like traditional addiction treatment might not be the best approach for people with autism.
Right. Those group therapy settings that a lot of programs use, they can be really overwhelming for people on the spectrum, and they rely heavily on social interaction and emotional expression, which can be difficult. Cognitive behavioral therapy and more individualized approaches seem to be more effective, but honestly, there's still a lot we don't know, and more research is definitely needed.
So the takeaway here is to start talking to your kids about drugs and alcohol early, even when they're young.
Absolutely. Prevention and education are so important.
All right, let's move on to another big one. Managing stress and sensory overload.
Ah, yes. Such a big part of life for so many people on the spectrum. Teaching them how to handle stress, that's a crucial life skill. And the first step is helping them recognize what stress feels like in their body. Are they breathing faster? Is their heart racing? Are their muscles tense? Once they can identify those signs, you can teach them some techniques to calm down, like deep breathing or muscle relaxation exercises.
I like that idea of using a numerical scale to help them track their emotions.
Oh, that's a good one. Like have them rate how they're feeling on a scale of 1 to 4, and that way they can start to recognize when their stress is building and they need to take a break or use a coping strategy before things escalate. Another thing that can be really helpful is having a designated calm space, both at home and at school. If the school doesn't have one, advocate for it. It can make a world of difference.
And mindfulness practices are becoming more and more popular for managing stress and anxiety.
For good reason. There's a ton of research showing how beneficial mindfulness can be. It can reduce stress and anxiety, improve sleep, just make you feel better overall. And what's really cool is that studies have shown that practicing mindfulness can actually weaken the connection between the amygdala, which is like the fear center of the brain, and other parts of the brain. So it basically helps you create some distance from those intense emotions. And you know what? It's a great tool for parents too.
So how do you teach mindfulness to a child on the spectrum?
It's all about breaking it down into small, concrete steps. And the best time to teach is when they're already calm and relaxed. Don't try to introduce it during a meltdown. That's not going to work.
All right, last but not least, let's talk about eating habits and the potential for eating disorders in kids on the spectrum.
Okay, so this is an area where there can be a lot of challenges. Like, we know that some autistic adolescents are prone to gaining weight and developing unhealthy eating habits. And it's due to a bunch of factors, like maybe they're not getting enough exercise, or they're on medications that cause weight gain, or they have sensory issues with food that limit their diet. And sometimes junk food gets used as a reward, which doesn't help. And the thing is, all of this can lead to more anxiety, worse sleep, and even health problems down the road.
So what's the best way to address these eating challenges?
Honestly, I think it's best to get a team of professionals involved. Like, a dietitian can help create a healthy meal plan that takes into account their sensory needs. A behavioral therapist can work on those food aversions and help them develop positive eating habits. And an occupational therapist can figure out exactly what sensory issues are going on with food textures and tastes. Occupational therapists can also help expand their diet by introducing new foods in a way that's acceptable. Like if they have trouble with the texture of fruit, maybe you blend it into a smoothie. But the key is to go slow, introduce things one at a time, because change can be hard for kids on the spectrum. And instead of using food as a reward, try rewarding them with activities, like something physical.
There are also some good online resources out there, right?
Oh, yeah. There's this website called Cooking with Autism, and it's amazing. They have cooking classes that are specifically designed for people with autism, and they have a cookbook that addresses all those common challenges like motor skills issues, sensory sensitivities, and the need to break down recipes into really clear steps.
Awesome. And this might come as a surprise to some people, but there's actually a pretty strong link between eating disorders and autism.
It's true. Research in the last decade or so has shown that there's a lot of overlap, especially in females. Studies have found that a significant percentage of women diagnosed with eating disorders also have undiagnosed autism. And, historically, the way autism presented in girls and women wasn't always well understood, so their restrictive eating or their focus on body image was sometimes just attributed to an eating disorder. There was even this informal term, female Asperger's, that was used sometimes. And there do seem to be some shared cognitive patterns like trouble with social relationships, rigid thinking and behavior, that super detail-oriented way of seeing the world, and sometimes a lack of awareness of how their actions affect others.
And treating an eating disorder when it co-occurs with autism, that must be tricky.
Yeah, it can be really difficult. And part of the problem is that there just aren't that many clinicians who are trained in both eating disorders and autism. For some people with ASD, restricting their food or exercising compulsively might be a way to manage anxiety or create a sense of order and control. And it's important to remember that boys and men with autism can have eating disorders too. It's just not as often recognized. When it comes to treatment, individualized approaches that take into account their social communication differences and sensory sensitivities are probably going to be more effective than traditional group therapy, which can be really overwhelming. So, the main takeaway is that eating problems are more common in people with autism than we used to think, and we need to be paying attention.
This has been such an incredible deep dive. So much good information. As we wrap up, what are some final thoughts for parents who are, trying to navigate all of this?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that it's okay to feel scared or even defensive when you're dealing with these sensitive topics. It can be frustrating when your child is so good at following certain rules, like online safety rules, but they struggle with basic self-care. And yeah, it can be embarrassing sometimes. And the thought of something serious happening like sexual abuse or legal trouble, that's scary. But the important thing is to remember that progress takes time and consistency. Keep using those visual aids, those social stories, break things down into small steps, repeat, repeat, repeat. The goal is to help them become as independent as possible, even if it's a slow process.
And to recap some of those key strategies for parents.
Okay, so first, remember that interest in dating and sex can happen even if your child seems developmentally delayed. So you've got to be proactive about teaching them how to stay safe. Second, be super vigilant about the possibility of sexual abuse and watch for any changes in their behavior that could be a red flag. Third, use those same skill-building techniques that you use in other areas, like breaking things down, visual aids, repetition, when you're teaching about dating and grooming. Fourth, create checklists and visual supports for self-care routines. It really helps them be more independent. Fifth, establish good sleep habits like no screens before bed, maybe a light snack, talk to their doctor about melatonin if you need to. Sixth, encourage exercise and mindfulness practices to help them manage stress. And seventh, don't be afraid to reach out to professionals like dietitians, occupational therapists, behavioral therapists for help with things like eating habits. They can make a huge difference.
So much good advice. It's clear that this is complex stuff and there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Definitely not. Every child is different, and what works for one might not work for another. You got to be flexible and willing to adjust your approach. But the most important thing is to keep learning, keep communicating with your child, and keep advocating for their needs.
So for our listeners out there, as you're thinking about everything we've discussed today, consider this. How can you make communication open and direct communication that's tailored to your child's unique way of understanding the world? How can you make that your most powerful tool? It's about creating that space where they feel safe, understood, and empowered to navigate these challenging but important aspects of life. Think about the strategies we've talked about and how you can use them in your own family. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone.